Look, we're in Ohio. Just a couple hours more, we're still on Route 224. Would you like to see the map?
But I can't read. Is this a trap? It looks like noodles with some dots. Is that a lake? We must be lost. Ohio's way too big, way too flat, and way too far. Please, oh please, just let me get out of this car. I'm going crazy in this maze. All these detours and delays.
Why don't you take a nap?
I'm not tired. Here's the map.
Just try counting all those sheep. That will help you fall asleep.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Watch Arthur weekdays on your PBS Kids station or anytime on the PBS Kids video app.